It was a crisp autumn evening when four close friends, Tom, Sarah, Emma, and Jack, decided to camp in the deep woods just outside their small town. The locals had long whispered strange stories about the forest, but the group brushed it off as nothing more than legends meant to scare kids. They wanted an adventure, something thrilling to shake up their routine lives. As dusk fell, the forest seemed peaceful, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. They laughed and joked while setting up their tents, feeling invincible in the face of nature. But as the night deepened, an eerie stillness settled in, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves vanished. A chilling silence pressed against their ears. Around midnight, Tom, the most adventurous of the group, suggested they explore a bit. Sarah was hesitant. "I don't know, guys. This place feels off. Maybe we should stay near the fire," she said, her voice quivering slightly. But Jack laughed it off. "Come on, Sarah. We've been out here for hours and nothing's happened. It's just a forest." Emma, always up for a thrill, grinned and grabbed a flashlight. "I'll go. Don't be a chicken." Reluctantly, Sarah followed, clutching her jacket tight as they wandered deeper into the woods. The towering trees closed in around them, and the moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. As they walked further, they heard it, a faint whisper. "Help me, please." They stopped in their tracks, exchanging terrified glances. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her face pale in the dim light. "Yeah, it's probably just the wind," Tom said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But deep down, they all knew. This wasn't the wind. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. "Help me. Don't leave me." "Who's there?" Jack shouted, his flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. The light flickered and died. Suddenly, Sarah gasped. "Look!" She pointed ahead, her hand trembling. Just beyond the tree line stood a shadowy figure, barely visible through the thick mist that had crept in. It was a woman, her clothes tattered, her face obscured by her long, tangled hair. The figure turned and started walking deeper into the forest, her steps slow and deliberate. No, Sarah muttered, backing away. "We need to go. Now!" But before anyone could move, Tom broke into a run, chasing after the figure. "Wait!" he yelled, disappearing into the darkness. "Tom, stop!" Jack shouted, sprinting after him. Emma grabbed Sarah's hand. "We have to go after them! We can't leave them!" They ran through the trees, branches scraping their arms and faces, the cold air biting at their skin. The whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction. "Help! Me!" Suddenly they heard Tom scream, a blood-curdling sound that froze them in their tracks. "Tom!" Sarah cried, her voice cracking with fear. They found him lying on the ground, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. She's not human," he whispered, barely able to speak. His body shook uncontrollably. "What do you mean? What happened?" Jack asked, helping him to his feet. But before Tom could answer, the temperature dropped even further, and the forest around them seemed to shift. The trees loomed closer, their branches curling like fingers reaching out to grab them. And then, the figure reappeared, closer this time. Her face was no longer hidden. It was a mask of horror, empty eyes, a twisted grin that stretched unnaturally wide. "We have to get out of here!" Emma screamed. They ran, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the whispering voices growing louder and louder, surrounding them. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, no matter which way they turned. Their fear was palpable, each of them gripped by the realization that they might never escape. "We're going in circles!" Jack shouted in frustration. Sarah stopped, tears streaming down her face. "It's her. She's keeping us here." Desperation set in as they tried to find their way back to camp, but every path led them deeper into the woods. Emma fell to her knees, exhausted. I can't go on." Tom, still trembling, pulled her up. "We have to. If we stop, she'll get us." And then, in the distance, they saw it, the faint glow of their campfire. "We're almost there," Jack urged, dragging Tom along. But just as they reached the clearing, the figure appeared again, blocking their path. This time, her whisper was loud, deafening. "Stay. With me." For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Fear gripped them, freezing them in place. The air was thick, suffocating. Sarah, with tears in her eyes, screamed, "Leave us alone!" She hurled a burning log from the campfire at the figure. The log landed at the figure's feet, and in an instant, the forest erupted with noise, the rustling of leaves, the howling wind, the creaking of trees. The figure shrieked, a sound so terrifying it pierced their very souls. And then, just like that, she vanished into the darkness. The friends didn't wait to see if she would return. They packed up their gear as fast as they could and ran back to their car, not daring to look back. They drove in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on their minds. It wasn't until they were safely home that they spoke about it. None of them could explain what they had seen or heard that night. But they all agreed on one thing. They would never go back to that forest again. The wind whispered through the dense canopy, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and moss. Jacob had wandered deeper into the forest than he had planned, chasing the remnants of an old forgotten trail. The map in his hand was useless now. Too many years had passed since it had been drawn. But Jacob wasn't one to turn back. He was a photographer, driven by the promise of untouched wilderness and untold beauty. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the forest around him grew darker, colder. The shadows lengthened, and the once inviting woods now seemed to close in on him. There was an uneasy quiet, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Jacob set up camp beside an ancient oak tree, its twisted roots gnarled and exposed like skeletal fingers reaching out from the earth. He built a small fire to keep the chill at bay, but it did little to calm the gnawing unease creeping up his spine. The isolation of the forest weighed heavily on him now, the silence too thick, too unnatural. As the fire crackled and the last light of day faded, Jacob thought he heard something, barely a sound, more like a distant rustling. He paused, listening intently. Nothing, probably just an animal, he thought, or the wind. But then he heard it again, closer this time, a soft shuffling, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Jacob stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark forest beyond the flickering light of the fire. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding far too small in the vast darkness. There was no reply, just the oppressive silence of the woods. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something move, a shadow, too large to be an animal, darting between the trees. He swung the flashlight in its direction, but there was nothing there. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps returned, now circling his camp, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he turned in circles, trying to follow the movement. His light flickered and sputtered out, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to relight it. When the beam finally flickered back on, it landed on something that froze his blood. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching him, tall and thin, its body wrapped in tattered, moss-covered rags, its face hidden beneath a hood made of bark and leaves. It didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting. Jacob backed away slowly, his breath shallow. His mind raced. Was this a person? Or something else? He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The words caught somewhere between his fear and disbelief. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, and then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it lifted a long, skeletal hand and pointed deeper into the forest, towards the heart of the woods. Jacob's legs felt like lead, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay here. The fire was dying, and this thing wasn't going to leave him alone. Gathering his gear as quickly as he could, he started moving, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for the figure in the shadows. It didn't follow him, but he could feel its presence, its gaze, urging him forward. The forest seemed to shift around him as he ran, the trees twisting and closing in, the path vanishing before his eyes. He was lost, disoriented, but he kept moving. The sound of the footsteps returned, now in front of him, leading him deeper into the woods. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his clothes. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, The figure was gone. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, oppressive, suffocating. Jacob collapsed by a stream, his legs trembling from exhaustion. The water was dark, reflecting nothing but the blackness of the sky. As he caught his breath, he noticed something strange about the trees around him. Their bark was twisted, their trunks marked with deep scars, claw marks, he realized, from something trying to escape. In the distance, a faint glow appeared, not the warm light of dawn, but something cold and unnatural. It grew brighter, closer, revealing the figure once more, standing by the water's edge. This time, its hood had fallen back, revealing a face twisted in agony, its eyes hollow, its mouth wide in a silent scream. The figure raised its hand again, pointing to the stream. Jacob's heart raced as he looked down. Beneath the surface, just barely visible, were bones. Human bones, scattered along the riverbed, as if discarded. A cold realization crept over him. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry. And now, it wanted him.